that do all the accounting, make all the books work, they have a hard time understanding lifetime costs and lifetime benefits associated with energy efficiency. And they get really squeamish when you want to talk about it as a resource. And what I mean by that is how reliable is it, right? You got to remember utility engineer mentality, right? When I push the button on a power plant to run, I know it's there, right? I don't have to worry about it. I got a power plant over here and I push the button, it's up and it's running, right? Now when we go to Bob and we say, okay Bob, we need 100 megawatts of energy efficiency, how are you going to do that? And Bob says, well, I'm going to go out to 10,000 homes and I'm going to put in all of this stuff and I'm going to put in some air conditioners and we're going to insulate and I'm going to depend on 10,000 different consumers to behave. How do you think those utility engineers react? They go, what? No, we just want to push the button over here. That's all we want to do. So Bob has about as hard a time dealing with our power planners as he does out trying to convince consumers energy efficiency is good. In fact, he may have a harder time. And so, back to the question. Why would a utility do energy efficiency? Well, what if I said I can turn that energy efficiency into a power plant? I can make it act like that thing that I push one button and make it run, right? If I can do that with energy efficiency, then the accountants can account for it, the planners can plan for it, and the operators can use it, and they can use it in an effective way. And if I can do that all with the competitive cost of typical power generation, then I don't raise the rates for anybody, and I don't have my increased costs, even though I might be losing some revenue on the other side. So that's kind of the challenge that I've been given, consequently Bob's been given, to try to sort out going forward. And I'll come back in a minute and talk about why I think that's important from a bigger sort of policy perspective. But let's talk a little bit about that. So it's got to be a competitive resource. It has to provide value to outweigh the cost, because you are going to lose revenue. That's a fact if you're a utility. And at the end, it's got to be highly reliable. Remember that first question I asked? We all want 24/7 power. And if we don't get the 24/7 power, we get really upset. So you got to have the high reliability. But let's explore that a little bit. Okay, well, how does it become a competitive resource? Maybe if I can push the right button. I think everybody's familiar with a daily load peak. You know, this is how the load changes as you go through the hours of the day. And we generally divide it up into three categories. We call base load, intermediate, and peaking load. Right? Base load are generally things that we use generation sources that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Great example is a nuclear plant or a coal plant. Intermediate load is those kind of generation sources that we would turn on and off periodically, or at least scale back depending on the load during the day. So that might be something like a gas plant that runs. And then peaking load up here are those resources that we would only turn on for a certain period of time and then turn them back off when we didn't need them anymore. Because remember, when you're in the electricity business, we're like super real time in terms of supply chain, right? As soon as it's made, it's got to be used. So when you start thinking about energy efficiency and demand reduction, you know, where can you use that? Well, in my mind, you know, energy efficiency could certainly take the peaks off, but you know, energy efficiency might actually help down here in this base load and this intermediate load area. Demand response, of course, can help take some of these peaks off. One of my other favorite generation sources is hydro, which we use a lot in the peak. We get asked why we don't use hydro as a base load resource, right? Because it is so great and cheap. The problem is it's fuel limited. What I mean by that is we only have so much water. And we don't live in a part of the country where we have what we call run-of-river rivers. I think that's an okay term. Such as the Mississippi, that are running constantly all the time. So we have to pick and choose when we run hydro. So it generally ends up being a peak resource for us. But if you can take things like energy efficiency and demand response and start showing and demonstrating how they fit into this load curve, you then begin to create some value for the utility. But then you got to compare it with the other things that the utility is generating and using. So, you know, these are real basic numbers. You can argue whether they're exactly right or not. Different people have different views, but I think in general they're pretty good. Coal, somewhere around $3,000 to $5,000 a kilowatt. Gas, cheaper than coal, obviously. And nuclear, it's pretty expensive. Energy efficiency, $600 to $1,000 kW, depending on, you know, what the program is, how it's designed. So yeah, from a cost standpoint, you're now getting pretty competitive with those other resources. Then you got to look at the other thing, that 24/7 issue, right? How reliable is it? Coal, 85–90% of the time those plants run. Gas, 87 to 92. Nuclear, 90 to 92%. Now you see, I've got question marks in the energy efficiency. So one of the things we are struggling with is what is, in the utility industry, we call that capacity factor. What is the capacity factor for energy efficiency, right? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? Some people would argue it might be 30%. And the reason that number gets hard to calculate is because all those things, I punch my button and I know how often it comes on, right? 90% of the time when I punch that button, it comes on. When I start relying on consumers, when I start relying on businesses, etc., for them to provide that resource, it gets much more squishy. And so you have to do things, you have to build programs in ways that somewhat guarantee what will be on, and then probably even more difficult, you got to convince the folks that run the power system that it's real. All right. The other thing we need to do is we need to make energy efficiency work with that curve. Now, this is a really cool curve, I think, because this is Bob's programs in energy efficiency. And let me explain a little bit about this chart. So that load chart I showed a few minutes ago, this is kind of the afternoon peak of that load chart right here. And the programs that Bob has been able to develop, when you take all of his programs together and aggregate the energy efficiency and demand reduction that they provide in any given hour of the day, is represented by these green bars, right? Well, what's cool about this from our perspective is you'll notice that follows the load shape. What that means is that's a resource that really well follows the way we have to meet load. That's valuable. That's really valuable. Because now I don't have to turn on and off extra gas plants. I don't have to turn on and off other resources. I can simply let the energy efficiency deal with this change, at least to some degree, in that load shape. Now you notice the dotted line is what these green bars add up to in the load, and it's not a whole lot yet, but that's because we're just getting started. We've got to do a lot more than where we're at. So that provides a lot of value to us. So then given that information, and this eye chart here is probably a little bit hard to see, but we then take that to our system planners. And what our system planners do is they take all the different resources there are, they look at how load's going to project out into the future, and they decide what is the best way to provide power. Keeping in mind we want 24/7 lights on, and we want cheap rates, right? So what these two charts show, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but it's pretty cool, is this one shows if I use energy efficiency as a big component to meet that demand, versus if I said, look, we don't have any energy efficiency, what does it look like? Well, what ends up happening is we now have to go out and buy a bunch more gas plants, either combined cycle or combustion turbine. So the cool thing is energy efficiency actually does save you from having to build hardware and put it on the ground. Now what about money, right? Back to the CFO and the CEO, that's what they want to know. How does this help you? So this is a present value calculation. And basically what it's showing is that in the early period, doing your energy efficiency, you got to spend money, right? But that's true with any sort of power plant you build, right? If I'm going to go build a power plant, I got to put concrete on the ground, steel on the ground. That all costs money. Well, okay, so does energy efficiency, right? We got to go put the systems in place, programs in place, in order to actually make them work. So you have those costs. Now the idea is, over the long run, right? In the case of a power plant, 30 to 40 year lifetime, you're going to recover your costs from all that electricity you're going to sell. Okay, so how does that work for energy efficiency? Well, this shows that over that time, that we actually begin to make positive cash and positive revenue requirements. In other words, reduce pressure on rates. And the reason that happens is because while energy efficiency isn't making electrons, energy efficiency is helping us avoid costs that we would otherwise incur, right? And so those avoided costs begin to accumulate and actually help us. Now I will say there's probably a limit here, and I'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But I'd be remiss without showing this chart, because this is really cool. Since Bob's been here, since the team that he's put together and is working, we're making some pretty significant progress in all of this. And you'll notice in all the years we've been working, we're exceeding our goals. And I attribute that, I think, to the quality of the work the folks are doing, but I think it's also because I think in our region, you know, we've had a need for this, and I think you're seeing consumers wanting to have it. And so how do we compare? And I won't spend a lot of time in here, but you know, we're always, in the Southeast, I think folks are always after us because we're not doing enough. And while, you know, I can't necessarily argue we're not doing enough, we're doing pretty good in our neighborhood. And that's important in my mind that we reflect it as our neighborhood, because part of it, and I think we've talked about some today, is about culture change, right? So for us to suddenly become the Northeast, or for us to suddenly become California, is a pretty difficult proposition. We have to grow into it as we go along. All right, let's see. So where are we going, and what does that mean? As I mentioned before, we're growing into this. And when we look at our integrated resource planning process that we've gone through, you know, here's where we are today from an energy efficiency standpoint. Here's what we want things to begin to look like in the future. And we want a much more balanced portfolio. You can see we're significantly reducing coal. We'll continue to reduce the coal, because the goal here is to get a much cleaner portfolio. You can see here, energy efficiency continues to grow. Now there's a trick here, and here is one of the conundrums that from a industry standpoint we've got to figure out. If this piece of the pie grows too fast, right? In other words, we get energy efficiency as a much bigger resource. Then that chart I showed where we have the positive benefits from the present value calculation turns over and goes the other way. Okay, well, so why is the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is back to the 24/7 power, right? As we get more energy efficient, right, or as people put solar panels on their house, or as we have other intermittent resources brought in, right, all of that means you use those hard generation assets on the ground less, right? But us as the utility still has to pay for those hard generation assets sitting on the ground. Now, so first question I get is, well, why don't you get rid of those hard generation assets on the ground? Well, back to that 24/7 issue. Everybody likes solar panels. They like their house to be more efficient. But what they tell us is, if the lights go out, you better turn them back on. So it means I've still got to have these power plants sitting back here to turn on. So the conundrum is, how do you do that and transition to the future? Because I think where we want to be in the future is much more renewables. You want to be much more energy efficient. And you want some of those hard old assets to go away. You know, maybe you even want distributed generation, as we talked about earlier today. But how do you get from here to there without putting a whole bunch of extra cost on the consumers for effectively stranded assets. And that's the challenge that we are struggling with, not only TVA, but I think the utilities in general. And so, in my mind, there's sort of two things that we have to think about as we move to this next world, and that is reliability. That's that 24/7, right? How do we ensure long-term reliability as we do more energy efficiency, as we do more clean energy solutions? And then what is the long-term sustainability? Right? How long do these resources last? Right? When I put a power plant on the ground, I know for sure that it's there for 40 to 50 years to produce power. Right? If I go in and make improvements to people's homes or to people's businesses, how long do I get to keep that before I got to go back and do something again? A lot of information about that, but the problem is it's not certain, right? And we as utility folks, and I'll admit, we're slow, very slow, and we're curmudgeonly, and we don't change easy. But to some degree, there's some good reasons for that. One is we're just the most risk-averse people on the planet. And that's something that we as the utility industry got to change. Secondly, we got a whole bunch of regulation, and we got a whole bunch of bureaucracy that's all built into this industry that you have to continue to manage through. And thirdly, all of this stuff I've been talking about costs billions and billions of dollars, and it takes years and years and years to put in place, right? Even when you talk about clean energy, when you talk about wind turbines, when you talk about the transmission to support it, when you talk about even energy efficiency and smart grid programs, they're very expensive, they take a long time, so you can't get it wrong. Because if you get it wrong, you cost everything. So there's some reasons we're slow, not necessarily a justifiable that we don't need to do, but we are slow. And then we get nervous because then this last part here, you know, the technology is changing lightning fast. You all know that. You're all on the cutting edge of some of that technology that's changing, right? We were talking at lunch here about distributed generation and the fact that it's there. I've been through what I call the distributed generation cycles now 3 times, right? It's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. It's going to happen and it doesn't happen. Well, this time I think it might actually happen because the technology has changed so fast and it's gotten so much better that it's not only cost effective, but the reliability is beginning to get to 24/7. So we have to think about as those change and what else is going to be coming. You know, consumers are changing. So one of the interesting factoids that I try to tell the utility people, another reason why we ought to think energy efficiency is a good thing, right, is if we all go back to the 70s, think about air conditioners and refrigerators, right, and the efficiency levels for those. Well, today they're massively more efficient than they were back then. But we're using more power. Well, okay, what happened? Well, everybody in here's got phones and iPads and cell phones. You know, we've all got 4 or 5 flat screen televisions in our house. So while everything has gotten more efficient, we've gotten much more dependent on electricity for everything we do in life. So you got to keep doing the energy efficiency because that keeps changing. And then finally, we're all under the pressure of costs. We're all under the pressure. And you know, in the Tennessee Valley, we hear every day, all of our local power companies that you heard from one earlier today, right? They want low rates, low rates, low rates, no matter what. And that's important, and it's important for consumers. Although we in the Tennessee Valley got to work on changing the conversation from low rates to low bills. But at the end of the day, you still have to keep the price down, right? Because it means jobs and it means well-being for the communities. So I think that's it. Greater energy efficiency is a big key to our vision. But in my mind, there is the conundrum of how do we shift from the model that we have today, that business model for utility, to the one we need in the future. And in my mind, it's not something the utilities can solve by themselves. It's something that has to be solved by all of us working together because it is the right thing to do, but we have to do it in a way that we do do it in a way that's the best value for all of the consumers that are out there. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. I quit. Do I have a couple minutes for questions? Okay.
You get to capitalize the cost of plants in about 40 years or whatever. Are you allowed to capitalize your investment in efficiency? And if you can, would it be helpful if you could?
Great question. Oh, sorry. So you capitalize plants over the lifetime of the plants. Do you capitalize energy efficiency over the lifetime of the energy efficiency? So it's a great question. So first of all, let me caveat, TVA is a tad bit unique. We don't report to a PUC. We're a quasi-government agency, but we don't get any government money. It all comes from the ratepayers. So our structure is a little bit different. So right now, today, yes, we capitalize the plants over the lifetime of the plants. But because of that uncertainty in the lifetime issue, when you sit down and have a conversation with the accountants, they want to capitalize the lifetime of the energy efficiency right now as you're incurring the cost. We've not yet been able to get them to move to that other model, but yes, it absolutely would be helpful.
There's a 20 years kind of the lifetime that I see mostly for efficiency improvements. Obviously not 40.
No, and I get that, but even the shorter is much better. We're still trying to convince them that that's real and that that's a legitimate way to capitalize. So not there.
The argument, if you could?
Yes, absolutely.
In your least cost planning, how do you value the externalities of water supply or clean air? And does TVA do it differently than other utilities in our region?
So I'll answer the second one first. I think we all use similar processes, but I think we probably go to a little bit more level of detail than some of the others do. It's an opinion on my part. To the first question, we deal with some externalities. So for example, as environmental emissions regulations are being promulgated, or ones that we expect to be promulgated. So the recent MATS ruling and Mercury ruling, the costs associated with controlling any sort of fossil plant associated with those are built into that analysis. In the case of carbon, for example, where we're not sure what's going to happen, we've made some assumptions that says 5 to 10 years out from now it's going to start costing us, and we've made some guesses at what we think that cost per ton of carbon is going to be. I'm 100% sure we're wrong, but at least it gives us a bit of a value to that. Water is another good example. As we look at water regulations and we look at our requirements for water use and so forth, that gets built into there. Some of the kind of really broad externalities we don't account for.
We do a energy efficiency program in your footprint in the Huntsville area, and what we've also done is incorporate people who have an energy efficient home, gone through our program, that they should also, if they're interested, do solar. But that we know that TVA is now pulling back from the incentives that have really helped solar installations happen in the TVA area, and that it's going down. And I know in your vision, looking at your slide, and renewables are not on there, I would say, and I would argue for my community, the northern Alabama area, that homeowners should do energy efficiency, and we're promoting that heavily, but that if in conjunction they want to do renewables on their home, that should be supported, continue to be supported by TVA. It's for your benefit, for TVA's benefit, since we're talking about bottom lines. So I wanted to see if you wanted to talk to that topic.
Sure, I will. And unfortunately, it's not a simple answer. So first of all, we put the incentives in place to help stimulate the market around solar development, which, to your point, has done a good job. In fact, in some cases, it's doing such a good job that it's a little faster than we've been able to react to it. We're dealing with that internally. But at the same time now, if we go back to least cost planning, you have to question how long do you continue to incentivize a technology that's significantly more expensive than any of these other technologies. Costs are coming down, I get that. And our actual incentive program and the tail off is actually correlated with DOE's analysis that says this is when we're going to get to cost parity. So if we're not on that curve, then that's a different conversation. But that's how we originally set up the thing. Now here comes the interesting problem that we've got to figure out how to deal with is, I'm back to those fixed assets. So I've got a lot of folks who can afford to put solar on their house, and they're putting solar on their house. Great. But now my assets back here, the costs are going up because I've got less kilowatt hours than I'm selling. So now I've got low-income folks, and I've got other folks that can't afford to put solar on their house that are now paying for the fact that I've got all of this generation reserve to make sure when the sun doesn't shine, you still have power. So I'm not trying to be critical because I think it's the right thing to do, but I don't know how to solve that problem yet. We have to solve that problem. It's a little bit different in the TVA service territory because we don't have a PUC. We can't get a return on any of these different investments. So at the end of the day, everything we do or don't do is paid for by the ratepayers.
Judge, great presentation. This is more of an industry question. So if you look at industries like steel, and definitely steel guys still like reflected for any level.